Well, welcome, Harvey. Thank you for sitting down with MINDfields. We appreciate it. You have served the discipline in a variety of ways, as well as the department, and on top of your research. But you're currently the International Studies Association president, past president of the Peace Science Society, and the Conflict Processes section of the American Political Science Association. Served as department chair both here at South Carolina, where you're the Dag Hammarskjöld chair, and also back in Indiana.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And a research career that covers many different topics in international relations and foreign policy, war, diffusion, alliances, and of course research methods and design as well. What research of yours do you think of that you're most proud of, that you're most satisfied with?
Well, the short answer, I think, would be the logic of inquiry work that I did with Ben Most, the papers that we did before that book came out, and the things I wrote afterwards. But I see that as just one part of sort of a whole direction in my career that came out of opportunity and willingness, and in the notion of an agent structure model, decision makers within structures trying to deal with the constraints and opportunities that exist, and that came out of my graduate work at Yale, my IR theory seminar where he assigned the Sprouts and their work, and and it was that whole way of looking at how to come at the phenomena in the world, right? So it was an agent structure approach. It led me to geopolitical and spatial questions, and Ben Most and I started working on the fusion, and the diffusion in particular, along with opportunity and willingness, led us to a whole set of research design issues. And, well, how do we do this? And how do people do this? And how can we do this? And that's, I think it came together in the set of papers that also became the book, and then work I did subsequent to that with Claudio Ciaffi-Ravia and Gary Gertz. But that's, that whole thread, where opportunity and willingness undergirded the logic of inquiry. My work in foreign policy, the Kissinger book, shows up in the textbook.
Yeah, good. And is the textbook first? Because what is the relationship between the textbook and that work with Ben on the logic of inquiry?
Yeah, well, the first edition of the textbook came out in '81. Ben and I had been writing papers together on diffusion since the mid-'70s. We were both interested in diffusion for a variety of reasons. My dissertation was about the consequences of war, which led to a SAGE monograph, which began to pick up the issue of war leading to war, right? Mm-hmm. Which then led me into diffusion,
okay.
But also the reinforcement that Ben and I developed in trying to figure out, what was going on in the world. Was it war leading to other people having war, or once you have a war, are you more prone to have another war? So a lot of that stuff had been done. I didn't sit down to write my sections of the textbook until 1979.
Okay. And you're already doing the work with Ben.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
So the diffusion work and the beginning of our thinking about a variety of logic of inquiry research design issues that we were forced to think about in doing that preceded the textbook, which then allowed us to put things in the textbook that that just weren't there in previous textbooks, and now are in all the textbooks.
Diffused out.
Yes, yes, they have.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, you know, the work that you and Ben most did that became the logic of inquiry, that was very influential when I was in graduate school, and I know not just where I was in Boulder, but just the whole cohort of people that I worked with, and I didn't mention, but that also then, you know, you mentioned that you were thinking about syllabi, but that also then plays a role in launching the textbook that you guys did. Is that?
Well, in fact, there were components of that because at the time I was writing the first draft of my sections of the textbook, Ben and I had been working on diffusion, and while we were doing that, it led us to confront a variety of issues that ultimately got put together in the logic of inquiry articles, which became the book, both, you know, the articles before the book and articles I did after the book. So in many ways, the genesis, which I think is one of the questions in MINDfields, was our interest in diffusion.
Right.
And in how to study it. And the interesting thing is, in a current work on failed states, we started with diffusion, and then trying to get to deal with diffusion, we realized there were problems we had to deal with. It was the same thing, and back in the 70s, there weren't the spatial statistics that we have today, and we had to figure out how do we deal with it, and what existed, and what data sets existed. So we had the 76 ISQ article, which presented our border data set, which predated the correlates of war data set by a couple of years. Once the correlates of war data set got created, Ben and I stopped doing ours because it was a much better data set.
Right.
But this was the first border data set. It was the same one that Severson and I used in the book Diffusion of War.
Right.
But to get back to your question, a number of the things that we had done in the diffusion studies were things I wanted to get into the textbook. And that was just one of a number of things that the textbook, whose first edition came out in 1981.
Okay.
It's in its 10th edition, but it's over 30 years. Things that were in that book when it showed up in 81 were in no other IR textbook.
That's right.
And now they're in everybody's IR textbook. And a number of those things did stem from the diffusion research and from the opportunity and willingness and the agent structure. And in fact, the menu for choice, which is Russ's. I mean, I thought it was a brilliant way of summing up literally the whole agent structure issue, which you have to confront when you're dealing with international relations textbooks, because it is IR and foreign policy.
That's right.
You can't get around it. And IR and foreign policy means there are people making decisions, and ultimately the position I always came back to, and Ben and I were thinking about that, it's in Most in Starr chapter 6 when we talk about how when we did simulations, where the slight changes in willingness changed everything far more than the constraints of the structure, right, the opportunity. So that in the textbook as the menu for choice, the key thing was putting the decision maker within different sorts of foreign policy, international political environments, and what the constraints and opportunity and willingness, how those affected the types of decisions made. Of course, and then you also had to bring in structures and processes, but those were part of the opportunity, the ultimate willingness where the decisions made. And I have always thought that in many ways is the most fertile way to continue moving through trying to understand international politics or any politics, that the politics is driven by decisions and decision makers. And as the Sprouts point out, for decision making, the only world that's important is the world that's inside the head of decision making.
Yeah, and I want to get you to talk a little bit more about the sprouts, because that's ringing very rusty bells. Like I know I read that, but I can't remember what the takeaway points are. So what were you, when you were going back to reading that work? What was it that led you? Was it questions that they didn't ask? Was it the framework they offered?
It was their framework. They did two basic things. One was the ecological triad, which was enter the environment and enter the environment relationship, which is clearly the core of opportunity and willingness.
Okay.
But the other thing they did was what sort of relationship existed, and as in essence geopoliticians, students of geopolitics, and looking at how geopolitics have been approached, one of their main aims was to get rid of geographic determinism, because that was the key relationship. Geography determined how people behaved.
Right.
And so they came up with a whole set of alternatives, and I only used three, but it was a larger set. And it was environmental possibilism. That's part of opportunity. What's possible in the environment?
Right. How does the environment structure that set?
Environmental probabilism. Which things are more probable? What types of things are more probable given the environment that exists? And then the core thing that held it together, which is what's always led me to be a methodological individualist, is what they called cognitive behaviorism, which means the world only really exists out there for decision making in terms of how you perceive it. Which is why I've always said we are all constructivists. Anyone who's done anything with decision making, with law, with anything, are constructivists. I mean, we may not absolutely emphasize the same things that lots of constructivists would like to emphasize, but we all are, because decision making goes on in your head. It's the world we construct, which is why in the 60s, I thought, when I was in graduate school, late 60s, there was this just explosion of political psychology about perception, about how you view the world, about belief systems, and all of those things. And I saw that stuff. I incorporated. I put much more of that in the textbook that had been the Bressett and Starr textbook than had been in previous ones, because it was so important to the sprouts. So these two things made the sprouts really important. And the echoes of moving away from deterministic views of the world have always been in my wheelhouse, and has been part of my major critique of lots of, not all, but lots of realist works. I mean, they're by people who went much more deeply into realism as political philosophy, as political theory, as opposed to a broad worldview. There have been characterizations of realism as deterministic, right? Because this is how human nature was, and this is the nature of the anarchic system.
Yeah.
So how can you get away from it? And I've always pulled away from that, and the sprouts were part of that as well. And Russet gave us that in graduate school, and his analogy of the menu became part of the textbook because it so well sums it up.
Yeah,
right?
it emphasizes the choice of decision makers across not any world they choose to create, but across a set of the probabilisms and possibilisms.
But it also picks up something that I remember there was a critique. We had a number of readers in the first edition or two, and someone said, you can order outside the menu. And people who know one of Jack Nicholson's early films, 5 Easy Peepers.
Okay. 5 Easy Pieces, sure.
Remembers that famous scene where he orders off the menu.
Right.
But so we wrote that. That's in the textbook. Remember that certain people with certain strong personalities or creative personalities can order off the menu. In addition to the fact that,
but not any menu of their choosing.
Oh no, But they can get creative. But they're ultimately. I mean, the example I always use in class is, how come Napoleon didn't use nuclear weapons in trying to take Russia? He says, "Oh yeah, because there were no nuclear weapons." So he couldn't.
And they still know that?
He couldn't get that creative, right?
Right.
But you can be creative in making up some new rules. And then when I talk about opportunity, I always like to stress that it's not just technology as we think of it in terms of weapons technology or transportation or communication. It's anything that humans use to adapt to the world, like figuring out double column bookkeeping, figuring out how you can create bonds to raise funds for kings and rulers and stuff like that. I mean, it's human invention to deal with the world and to create more opportunities or expand opportunities or move away from constraints. And as I said a couple of minutes ago, I've always thought that that's the way to think about international politics. And the reason why I liked the agent structure approach is that it forces you to pull all of that in, or at least think about it. I mean, each specific piece of research, if it's going to work, it's probably going to have to be much more focused and discrete in what it's doing. But in terms of theoretically thinking about how you want to come at it, I've always thought that's so much more useful. That's why I moved away from disciplinary ways of doing things, because a good social scientist should be drawing from all the social sciences as well as the hard sciences, quote unquote hard sciences. Even though certain things may be working at certain levels, or you want to focus at behavior at certain levels, you can't ignore the other levels. In fact, agent structure forces you to integrate the levels, because people say, well, you're looking at that decision-making level. I want to look at the systemic level. I mean, of course, Singer's classic levels of analysis one told you what you get at different levels. But in studying international relations and foreign policy, it's that decision maker at whatever level you want, the individual, the group, the government agency, the government itself, the society, is still surrounded by a certain type of environment. And it used to be, you'd think, well, the whole globe itself isn't surrounded by an environment, but in fact we now know it is, right? And in fact, again, except for Sprouts, there weren't many textbooks by the time we were writing Russet and Starr that were spending that much time on the environment. The Sprouts actually did that as well. And in fact, ISA has awards named for the Sprouts from the environmental studies section.
Yeah.
That's where some people think of the Sprouts, people who are concerned with the environment, in the sense that we think of ecology and resources and pollution and limits, constraints. But they were concerned with the environment the same way I was, in the sense of environmental possibilism. What are the possibilities and constraints?
With many structure, the larger structure. Well, I didn't actually throw it out in the form of a question. What led you to undertake the research project? We've gotten that in, and you talked a little bit about the evolution of the field, but I want to just ask you a little more directly. Over the course of your career, what can you think of that should have received more attention? Whether it's something that has been cast aside or fallen by the wayside, or something that just never got attention. What stands out at you as you look back over the period that you've been a professional political scientist, social scientist, that you think, gee, it would have been nice if more brain hours had been invested on X?
Well, my initial take on that question was what sort of stuff I did should have gotten more attention. But that broader one is really strange, because I don't know how I want to answer it. Early on in my career, when I was teaching the IR theory course, we started out with issues like how do we define the field? What is IR and stuff? Because that's the sort of stuff I read in graduate school. But I only did that a couple of times before I realized that's the wrong question.
Okay.
And I used to start the IR theory courses, whether in Indiana or South Carolina, or in fact I taught it at Australian National University one semester, with the question, what isn't IR? Prima facie,
yeah,
on the face of it,
what
what is not part of the study of international relations and foreign policy? And in fact, prima facie, almost nothing can fit in that category. Literally everything could become, depending on the theory you have, the perspective you're taking, and the question you want to ask. And so that's my cop-out to your question, because, you know, I mean, people have studied sort of almost everything. What should have gotten more? Well, you know, perhaps things that weren't studied as much at certain points as they were later were constrained by data availability or by methodology or just by the fact that people didn't think about very much, but now they have. So it's really hard to sort of say, well, people should have been doing more on blank and blank and blank before we had the capability to create much better and more effective computer simulations. It'd be like saying,
right,
oh, well, Louis Richardson really dropped the ball because he should have done so and so and so and so, not realizing he didn't have anything that even vaguely looked like a computer
right,
to help him do that stuff.
Sure, of course.
So I'm always a little.
Which ties itself very nicely to the general fragment. The structure constrains what was possible for him intellectually. But let me.
So I'm a little leery about answering that question for the discipline as a whole.
Sure. But let me see if I can bait the hook a little bit on something that you were saying, because you, as you said, in the 60s, there was a lot of emphasis on perception. You know, we can think of Graham Allison, you mentioned the Sprouts. If you go back and look at the syllabi, even when I'm in the late 80s in graduate school, there's still, you know, that work was being published in the 60s and 70s, and I was being exposed to at least a week, if not more of it. If you were to look at syllabi from today, you don't see a lot of emphasis on perception, and, you know, so would one argue that the rise of the success of rational choice, which at that time was very, you know, fringe.
That was fringe,
right?
That was banging on the door trying to get in. People always forget that lots of the things they think of as orthodoxy had to bang on the door to get in, and while they were doing that, they were not being privileged.
That's right.
To use the term.
Right. But has the success of that crowded, because there's not much perception. There's some increasingly in behavioral economics and so forth. We're getting, you know, it wouldn't be called perception. We could make a case, but you know, as you look at sort of the 80s and the 90s,
wow,
did perception get lost somewhere?
Okay, so I'm running this right off the top of my head because I'm not sure I've thought about some of these things quite this way. The stuff that I think that was going on in the 60s and into the early 70s was part of this expansion of borrowing from other social sciences and seeing what they could do and how they could help us. And social psych in particular had tons of stuff to give us. And when I was saying that about perception, I was thinking about books by political scientists, but also psychologists. You know, Ralph White's classic book about black-white thinking, images of the enemy and stuff like that. And it was like, oh, this stuff is out there. How do we bring it in? Now, I might be getting this wrong, but when I think of ISA and the sections and people and how they discuss themselves, I think after a time when things were being pulled together, I mean, Rosenau's classic anthology was called International Relations and International Politics and Foreign Policy, IPFP.
Right.
I think part of this is the fact that people studying foreign policy have tended to, again, sort of split foreign policy off from international politics, and on the other side as well. So I'm not blaming anyone.
Sure.
I think the two things have separated some, and I was involved in part of this because I remember Rosenau and I had an exchange in international interactions based on papers we gave at a conference. I could find the book,
Right.
where it was the
Back when conferences produced the edited volumes.
Herman, Kegley, and Rosenau volume on stuff, and it was Rosenau's attempt to create a quantitative comparative foreign policy based on his pre-theory. But going back to inquiry, logic, and international politics, there were so many research design problems with that whole enterprise. It sort of fell apart, and that was one way to sort of bring it together. And in that interchange with Rosenau, I remember saying, you know, there is a lot of comparative foreign policy. It just isn't the sort that you pictured in the pre-theories. I mean, Allison was bringing org theory and was bringing groups doing politics and stuff like that. And IPE was another type and stuff. It just wasn't what you were thinking about. But I think after that attempt, people doing foreign policies tended to go that way and IR that way and stuff. So one of the reasons why I didn't want to say that no one was doing, that perception has fallen away in images and stuff, because people like Steve Walker has continued to work that way, and his students, and Rick Herman at Ohio State and his students. There are still people doing that. Alex Mintz still pops in and out. And then there are people we don't think of as much who tend to be thought of, oh, they're doing foreign policy analysis. But it's not foreign policy analysis of the sort that was done in the 40s and 50s and stuff, where you looked at the chronology of,
that's right.
of behaviors, near the slow journalism of,
Right.
of what were the actions and decisions and stuff. But in fact, there is a lot of perception still built into that, and in ways we don't think about, in the sense of how event data sets are collected and constructed, and how they're used, and how you match them off against rhetoric in content analysis. Something I did in the Kissinger book that Ole Holste had done previously on John Foster Dulles, but you still find people doing that sort of thing. But there's one factor I haven't mentioned.
Okay.
And in the 60s, when so much of the social psych was being used and thrown at us, and seeing, this is how people think about things, and this is their belief systems, and how are they constrained in terms of how they make decisions and give themselves identity and all those things. There were all these incredible experiments being done by social psychologists on human beings, right? You know, some of the most notorious, of course, some of them like Milgram's experiments. And once you had human subjects regulations brought in, all of the really interesting social psych stuff stopped. I mean, not important. I mean, there's still useful stuff, but the interesting stuff, the stuff that captured your imagination and students' imagination and graduate students, Muzaffar Sharif and the Robbers Cave experiment, and even Solomon Ashen, which is the longer line, which is the shorter line, and people being put under stress, the Stauffer experiments with the GIs at the end of World War II. You can't do any of that stuff now. So that might be another reason. And one other thing, and it's hard to say this because you never stop because someone's done it, but once Bob Jervis and some other people really sort of set out some of these issues, in his classic 76 book, a lot of people said, okay, we know that, we know we should think about it and take it into account. We'll see whether we can get data sets and stuff, and of course, that's probably another thing. It's hard to do it. But again, I mentioned Walker and Rick Herman. They found ways in which you can create data sets, right? People that's how I got into event data and stuff, because there are forms of content analysis that will allow you to create the sort of data sets, and without having to get huge grants to hire 75 coders. You know, I'm thinking of Ed Azar and Copdad, with students coding all these things, whereas Phil Schroet develops artificial intelligence computer programs.
Kids originally.
Kids and Tabari. Yeah, that can scan text and make sense out of it and be creative. You're right. You know, you can teach it to look for the right things and stuff. So so in a sense, yeah, there's been some split and less of attention by some people, but in other ways, there's in some ways there's even more attention than ever. I was just doing something for Claudio Ciaffi-Revia, and I was looking at his CV and some of the things he's been doing. You know, computational. What am I looking for? Computational statistics, computational analysis.
Computational modeling.
Modeling.
Right? The agent-based modeling, those kinds of ideas.
I mean,
right?
Some of the things being done in that area are just spectacular, and it's possible that, you know, you asked a very reasonable question, and I was thinking, and I was trying to think of some of the answers. But one possible answer, and that happens all the time because you mentioned just formal modeling, rational choice, etc., is sometimes there are some things that most people don't understand. So it's going to take a while for enough people to understand something for it to be used a lot and to be brought into more and more of the work. And maybe, you know, computational modeling may be some of that.
It's still not,
yeah.
Just speaking for myself, it's still not there. And it's fun to see.
But it's doing incredible stuff. The people who are doing it well, as with all things, remember, every approach, every method, you have some people, a small group, you know, it's a normal distribution. It has a small tail that do it really well, and a much bigger group that do it okay, and a bunch of people who do it terribly, right?
Yeah.
So, but the people who are doing it well are doing some really interesting stuff. So, I mean, that's also partly why I didn't want to answer, you know, what hasn't gotten enough attention.
Which I'm going to go to, but first I just want to recognize it's great to see your enthusiasm. You know, you mentioned, I think you said it was chapter 6 of Most and Starr and the simulations you did, but I can see you know, if you were able to take that project on today, just with computers, and it's just a completely different tool set. You know, now you can be Napoleon and be stuck having to decide whether or not, you know, are you really going to use those nukes or not, because you've got just a completely different set. Well, the image I want to toss at you is, you know, one of the great things about academia is that we are decentralized. We each, as you know, we have that freedom if we're able to get the tenure track job and then earn tenure to make choices about how we do our work. There is no dictator. But I want to ask you to, you know, to imagine that you could play dictator, and let's just say you could take 20% or 40% of the brain hours spent in IR, in political science, and repurpose them. You know, that you could say, you know, I wish less time had been spent here, and we've already got some sense of where maybe it would have been better spent, but where do you think some of those resources from where you sit today, like, it was probably not as well justified as it seemed at the time?
Even in last semester, I was going to say 2014, but it wasn't 20, it was 2013. Last semester I taught, probably for the last time, my graduate course in international conflict. And in the first few weeks, I have them read little texts which give a broad overview of social conflict as studied by sociologists and social psychologists. You know, I don't have them read Koser and Zimmel anymore, but I have them read overviews of how people behave in groups and how they see themselves, and all of those sorts of dynamics. And the study of social conflict is as much about cohesion and cooperation and positive interactions as it is about negative ones. So now I'm getting to your question.
Yeah, okay.
Because if I had that brother, I would hope that more people would have gone back and looked at those sorts of processes. Because the study of international conflict, I was just looking at a project I'm involved in, looking at the career of Bruce Russett, and it's very clear, he says in various places, I was interested in the study of war and peace. And lots of people say they're interested in war and peace, conflict and cooperation. But 95% of what they study is conflict, not the cooperation side. That's why I wanted to say, when I do conflict course, I start them with this interdisciplinary, which is what I got as a graduate student, this interdisciplinary approach which talks about the dynamics of human interaction. And when there are incompatibilities and how they deal with those, and how bonds of identity and things lead them to certain highly negative behavior, but also highly positive behavior. That's why any discussion of human nature is foolish, because anything in human nature that you could say, if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have this type of nasty conflict. If it wasn't for that, we also wouldn't have these bonds of cooperation, right? And stuff. So that's the long answer. The short answer is, I would like more people to have gone back and really taken apart the very broad theories of integration, see where they lead us. This is integration theory and not what most people would call contemporary integration studies, because the studies of the EU are about what are they doing, how are they doing it, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, much of the study of the politics of the EU is very similar to the study of American politics. Right? Except they're talking about a group of so-called Westphalian states rather than the states of the Union, right? So those are integration studies, but it's not developing further the notion of the dynamics and the theoretical bases about how people in different identity units, right? The social psychologists will call them either identity groups or struggle groups or whatever. How, in fact, they interact and work with one another. So there was a burst of that in the 80s with the study of regimes, right? And Axelrod and Cohen did stuff, and Ken Oy did stuff about how you get not just coordination, but collaboration and cooperation across states. And a lot of that comes out of the earlier integration theoretical literature. And so if I could redirect more of these academic hours to study, that's where I would go. Because I think, particularly in the world of 2014, where you have huge numbers of probably almost the majority of countries in things that Carl Deutsch would have called pluralistic security communities, groups of states that have taken the military option out of their menu, right? They've crossed off the menu, we don't serve that anymore, right? That this is really important. People don't spend a huge amount of time studying alliances anymore because they're not terribly important in the contemporary world. The realism, most of realism, most of the time, isn't very useful to us in the contemporary world because conditions have changed. And by the same token, we need to be looking more at these various integrative mechanisms and the forces that push it and the forces that hold back. Something that I can't say we need more people looking at, because there are lots of people looking at, and that's development, right? How do you get poor countries rich, and at what level do you look at them in terms of broad general notions, or as opposed to everyone's a specific individual case, and where are some of the in-between things where there are lessons that apply more to this and that. Given that there are people studying those things, we need more people studying the cooperation things. I think when we get them together, and some people play with getting them together. It's just that, again, going back to my current project on failed states, I see how these things all come together, right? The economics, the internal conflict, the external conflict, how those conflicts are resolved. So people are doing bits and pieces of this, but really thinking about how it goes together. There's one sort of version of this, but most people wouldn't have thought about it as I was talking about it, and that's the work done. The best example is Russet and O'Neill on the Kantian piece, trying to get the components put together.
Right.
That's one version, but it's not one that goes as far as what I'm thinking about.
Well, and I don't think the students educated in the last decade, maybe 15 years, are really reading Deutsch and that broader perspective, even though it was, conceptually it was very broad, in terms of how it typically is consumed, is focusing on the construction, the post-war construction in Europe. But this, we could take this back to grand, mid-range, right? And what level of theory are you pitching? And what I'm hearing you say is, throughout as we've been, engaging for the past however long it's been, 20 minutes or half hour, you're still very interested at a grand level. And I think that the field has really gone very micro, right?
Well, I gotta go back to Most and Starr, because one of the things we pounded in there, and some people have gotten it, others never have gotten it, is be clear about what the question is you want to ask.
Of course.
What is it you're really asking?
That's right.
What does this concept really mean? What is this phenomenon really about? I mean, we had a section in there about, even in the 80s, when people were studying alliances, the literature never added up.
Yeah.
Because people were saying, oh, they're alliances. They're important. Let's study them. But why? Why are you studying them? What's the big question? And stuff like that. But one of the things that we said there and in other pieces, and I've said it since, is we should always know what that big broad question is, what that big broad interest is.
Even
there, the theoretical question is big. When we get down to our research questions, the actual research we want to get down to, they're going to be much more focused and narrow. And that's fine, because you can't study that.
Yeah, that's right.
You only can study it there. So every student, certainly every graduate student at South Carolina, and probably lots of them at Indiana, will know exactly what I'm going to say now. You got to think of it as the funnel. They come in, and I want to know what they're going to do their research design on or whatever. And I say, we're going to start at the biggest end of the funnel. What are you interested in? They sort of look at me and they say, well, I want to do a study of, this country and that country. And so I said, no, I don't want to know any of that.
Yeah.
What are you interested in? And we get there, and then I start asking questions, and we start getting down and down. And they say, okay, now we're in a zone that we can really start talking about, what the
research question is going to be.
So in many ways, I do believe in big theory. I won't call it grand theory, because people will talk about grand strategy and stuff like that. I don't like that. But you need to understand the big stuff, and then you start bringing it down. And in there, you understand the concepts you're dealing with and which dimensions of those concepts, because you can get lost in a lit review that talks of that deals with your concept, but any of the concepts worth thinking about have multiple dimensions, right? I mean, that's what makes them interesting. That's why that's why you want to talk about what's democracy, right? In class, when we start doing this stuff and people sort of, what's he doing? I'll say, well, what's love? Right? 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 So, but when you start working with a concept and you're not even clear which dimensions of it you want to work with, you're going to be all over the place, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So the funnel gets narrower and narrower, and that's what makes a research agenda or a research project or something, that you're taking different directions off of a core set of interests and broader questions, and then you're studying them by the implications, just the same way we all know you never actually test a theory. What you do is...
Do we all know that?
Well, you should know that.
I know.
But what you can do is to look for, how well the implications of the theory for this relationship or process or whatever are supported or not supported by systematic empirical inquiry. All right, and so I don't want the Starr wants to just no. We need to start there, and you start there because then you can figure out where in fact you want to go as you get narrower and narrower in the funnel. And as I said, any the people out there who have been my students, if they ever watch this, they'll laugh. They're laughing now. Stop laughing. I told you about this.
That's great. Well, let me go to the next question. If you, whatever you think of as your mid-career, had an opportunity to interview someone for a project like MINDfields, who would you want to sit down with?
Well, I thought about this, and in many ways it was easy.
Okay.
I started graduate school in '67, and they're what I consider to be a set of giants in the field. And the interesting thing is that just about all of them were multidisciplinary. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I only met Carl Deutsch once or twice, very briefly, and he had so much impact on Russet. And think about the range of students, the core of those students that worked with him there. I mean, you had Russet, but also Hayward Alker, Richard Merritt, very different sorts of people. And so obviously, someone like Deutsch. I never met either of the Sprouts. I mean, those are clearly people I would have wanted to talk to. When I was in Indiana, I met Ken Boulding several times, a couple of times. At least 2 or 3 times he came down to Bloomington for a variety of reasons. But I never thought to ask him these types of questions. So, Boulding is somewhat. But of all this group, well, Johann Galtung is still alive and kicking and doing stuff, but less multidisciplinary. He's fairly strictly a sociologist. Anatole Rappaport.
Yeah. Okay.
That is the guy. In graduate school, reading Fights, Games, Debates, my head exploded, and it hasn't gotten back together since. And the background that he had and the impact he had, along with Boulding and others, in founding the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and his just general work on conflict, but that also had this cooperation.
That's right, absolutely.
Component and dimension. So I think it would be Rappaport, and I'm happy that a few years ago, I remember. I think it was the conflict processes section. We're looking for a lifetime award winner, and I remember a couple of them talked to me about possibilities, this and that. And I can't remember if I said it or somebody else did. If it were someone else, I said, yes, that's it. Go do Rappaport. And so I was happy that happened at some point.
Right. All right. Great. Final question. Thinking about today and going into the future, what strikes you as the most promising areas of research?
It's not an actual specific substantive area, but one of the things that I've written about explicitly, had an edited book based around it, though it was a fissure for Bruce Russell, was crossing boundaries. The notion that there's this interaction between internal and external,
Yeah.
and that there are boundaries, but you want to cross between whole disciplines, but also between the subfields of disciplines, between basic research and applied research, meaning, you know, the academic and policy, and trying to pull this together, and then methodologically. I have trouble in my head figuring out what the difference between qualitative and quantitative is. I think almost anything people say is qualitative either is or could be quantitative, and vice versa. Are you talking about the data? Are you talking about the data collection methods? Are you talking about the data analysis methods? Are you talking about the number of cases? I mean, I can take anything you pick and show you how it can be either or both, and it almost always is a combination. And so the thing that I think is really important here is what is now becoming a much more distinct trend of dissertations being multi-method, and that you have this question, and in exploring the various sides of the question, you can do certain things with large N, which will require highly sophisticated methodological tools to do it right, and maybe sets of cases that you can study in several ways, maybe not one case but smaller numbers, and I know some people aren't hugely happy with it, but I always find it sort of interesting to try to do some of the things Charles Reagan has developed.
I would agree.
To do comparative case studies, and I can give you a footnote on Charles Reagan in a second. To, in fact, process tracing case studies. Not to do them for the sake of doing it, but given the question you're asking, which ones of these things will help you give you answers to this side of the question? And I just like that. So, if the question is the promising areas, I sort of like those, and particularly the things that cross comparative and IR. Again, if you ask faculty and students here, because they hear this question in job interviews and talks and stuff, I'll say, this sounds a lot like it could work with this part of the Bueno de Mesquita political survival model. I really like political survival. But, we started however long ago talking about the sprouts.
Yeah.
The ecological triad crosses comparative.
That's true.
And stuff. And the democratic peace crosses it. And if you're going to do political IPE correctly, political economy, it has to combine IPE and CPE, which, in fact, I think most people can't really figure out what the difference is. So that the key thing is to help bring subfields together, at least comparative and IR, in ways, and continue to bring them together in ways which, in fact, may make them look less distinct. That doesn't bother me. I don't have any deep identity. I'm an IR guy and stuff. I'm
change your construction.
I'm interested in questions, and how do we get it at these things, and so that's what I like, and what I like is that there's more and more of this stuff. It's become a cliche when you say, well, it's a two-level game or it's a nested game and stuff, but I think that's the way to look at things, right? That if you don't, you're missing stuff that you ultimately need to bring in.
Yeah, you're at least implicitly holding it constant, and none of us really think it's constant.
And so here's this thing about Charles Reagan. I actually didn't read his 1987 book till about 1990 or 91.
Okay.
And I was struck by, there were places where we clearly have different views.
Yes.
But I was struck by how similar lots of it was to Most and Starr.
Yeah, I have assigned those, not recently, but I've assigned those in the same week.
Here's an interesting point. And I haven't gotten a good answer because Most died in 1986, so he died before our book came out. and he never saw Reagan's book.
Right.
So I never asked him. I think I've asked Charles once, and he really sort of looked at me and said, I don't know. And I've asked one other person who I'll mention in a second. When I was an assistant professor in Indiana, and Ben Most was a graduate student, and we had already started doing our diffusion stuff, and which was leading us to begin to talk about these issues.
Right.
Charles Reagan was an assistant professor of sociology in Indiana, and we were all interacting in and quote-unquote members of the Center for International Policy Studies, which was John Gillespie and Dina Zinnes's Ford-supported interdisciplinary Center for International Policy. Yes.
Okay.
Right. And we must have interacted. And so I asked David Collier, because David Collier was one of Ben Most's dissertation directors. Ben did a comparative politics dissertation.
Oh, okay.
His dissertation was on Argentine public policy.
Really?
That he did with John Gillespie and David Collier.
Okay.
And I said, and David has a lot of this in him. So so I think Ben got it from a bunch of it from David. And I did too, because if you look at a lot of the contemporary work, again, you think of Collier, Starr, but we say a lot of the same things. I assigned tons of his stuff in the in the political science course. The basics, doing
research
political
design,
research,
methods,
research design / philosophy of science stuff. I assigned a lot of Collier, a lot of Gertz too, who gets a lot of sociology impact because he knows Reagan. Reagan's at Arizona, right? where Gary was for a long time. So there was something in the water, and no one can quite figure it out because because me, Ben, Reagan, Collier, all sort of are coming at this in I won't say the same, but complementary and compatible ways. And I think that's really interesting, and that might in fact be another good advertisement for these multidisciplinary centers, institutes, etc. Because Zinnes and Gillespie did a really nice job of having a group of people doing stuff and writing papers.
I actually did have an opportunity to interact at a very minor level with Ken Goulding at the Institute for Behavioral Sciences, which is one of these multidisciplinary, I think it's the University of Colorado. There was a brown bag seminar, and Ken was a regular attendee. I was not a very regular attendee, but I went from time to time, and so got to hear him ask questions and inquire with speakers and such. Well, you tossed out at the beginning that you wouldn't bore us with this story, but I am curious about how it was that you ended up becoming an IR scholar. You landed Yale, and you were thinking about something else. You weren't sure what's that story?
Well, as opposed to what most people have to do today, when I applied to all of the graduate schools, and
I did not.
And
so we had different experiences.
And
there.
only Chicago didn't offer me money.
Okay.
I didn't have a focus. I didn't say I'm going to do IR. I'm going to do American. I'm going to do so.
Was that common for the day, or was that?
It was not uncommon.
Okay.
It was. I don't think I was strange that way. I know, given the background I had and I've told the people at Buffalo this, that I had a better training going into graduate school than probably most of the other 15 students in the first class that came from highly prestigious universities and stuff. Because in the honors program, which was only a few people, we learned philosophy of science, we learned research design. In my senior year, we were actually, the four of us were actually part of a big project that Les Milbrath was doing at Niagara Falls High School, where we did experimental design,
really?
Pre-test, post-test, giving different treatments in terms of different lecture types and things, typing up the data, graduate students ran it. They didn't ask us if we had statistics, but we punched them into cards.
Yeah, you did the and
did the counter sorter so that we could have 2x2 tables and 2x3 and 3x3 and stuff like that. So I did very well in the sort of research design philosophy of science course. I liked that sort of stuff. I liked that sort of stuff in my classes.
Do you remember who taught it?
Oh, the year, my first year, Bob Lane did it.
Okay.
It's interesting because his major work was long interviews. His book on attitudes towards politics was, I think, maybe a set of 10 really, really extended sets of interviews with just common people.
Right.
Yeah. So he could tell us all about interview techniques, but he also did the Nagel and the Kuhn and all of that stuff. So I really didn't have a focus. I mean, I liked IR stuff. I had a chance to tell him this. This is 2014. I think let's see, was it last year? No, it was before the election. So it was in October 2012 at a meeting of the International Security Studies section of ISA along with the APSA section. The person organizing that had a special panel for Glenn Snyder, and she did her honors thesis in Indiana with me, Patty Weitzman. And so she invited me to be on this panel for Glenn Snyder. And she didn't know that I took my first 2 IR courses ever from Glenn Snyder.
Okay.
So I sort of liked IR. He introduced me to game theory, to prisoners dilemma, to strategic deterrence, and all of that, strategic relationships. So I'd had that, but I liked my other political science courses. And to tell you the truth, I can't remember exactly what semester it was, but I had certain courses to take, and I was looking and saying, what else should I take? And one of them was James Barber's course called something, The Presidency. And I said, oh, that sounds interesting. And I don't want to talk ill of the departed, but other graduate students said, oh, no, you don't want to take that. Your paper, what you're going to be do is assign the president and a long coding sheet, and that you needed to go out and get all this data on the president and stuff. So, but he was in the process of doing presidential character.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, yeah. And I said, well, what else is there? And, well, Russet was doing the IR theory seminar. And I said, I think I'd rather do that. And I took that and was hooked.
Yeah.
Right? You had Rosenau all over the place. You had the sprouts. You had the decision making. You had, some of the perception, the political psychology stuff and everything. And boom, that was it. That was it.
Awesome.
So if Barbara had written the book and the course was really about presidents and stuff, I might have said, oh yeah, that's interesting. I want to do that. I might have been doing American politics.
Right. Yeah.
Which would have been the wrong choice. It was the wrong choice.
Great. Well, hey, thank you very much again for sitting down with us.
I appreciate it. This was fun. I'm honored that you asked.
Great. Okay. Thank you.